Virtucio. I am a PhD student with Kenichi Soga, and I'm here to present some work that we've done from like a year or two ago now. But yeah, so this project was a collaboration with Professor E.T. and Barbara Settner from back then from UCLA. And our project was basically coming up with a loss assessment study for the Port of LA region. And so to reach that objective, we had to come up with a workflow. So this presentation will be explaining the details of our workflow and sharing some of our results. So I guess this slide I don't really have to spend too much time on. I feel like we all know the importance of like resilience. I think one thing to note in particular, which a lot of people probably already know, is that like bridges are an important part of like the transport infrastructure, like anywhere, even the US. And one small fact is that in the US, from 2017, like the average bridge is already like 43 years old. And so it does call for like work around this and the resilience of the network. So going on to our objectives. So one of the goals of this study was to come up with a workflow that gets us from like a hypothetical earthquake into like loss results in terms of maybe economic or network level consequences. So our focus on this part was like the Port of Los Angeles for reasons that it's the largest port in the US and that it also makes up most of the container traffic coming in and out of the US. So this is our framework. We had a 4-part framework. The first part is hazard characterization, so determining what the hazards are and their loads. The second part is infrastructure damage assessment. Here we focus on bridges. So bridge modeling, deriving fragility functions, and estimating the functionality losses. Third part is coupling it with a transportation network analysis. So in our work, we used like a semi-dynamic traffic assignment model to analyze the impact on the transportation network using the output from our bridge models. And then lastly, we want to use that to generate like some economic assessment in a way of like what the impact is of this earthquake. The first part, the first half, the left side of it, was worked on mainly by our colleagues from UCLA, and then the right part was worked on mainly by myself. And I will still try to go through like their methods, but I might not be able to like explain it as well. But just for like the sake of completeness, I'll go through it. So in terms of hazard characterization, we want to determine what the hazards are that we are going to study and what the loads are. And for us, what we chose to focus on was, again, like in the port area, so we wanted to analyze a magnitude 7.3 scenario earthquake that's like 2 miles off the coast of Los Angeles. And then in terms of, I think what's unique about this framework at least is that this particular site, which is the next one, we used like bridge models that instead of using like the archetype fragility curves, we went ahead and modeled all the bridges using an image based methodology. So we used like data from Google Street View and satellite images and matched this with like centerline data, and then we were able to generate like structure and site-specific bridge models for the area. So after extracting like this geometry information, we're able to extract also like statistics data from like traditional sources of like bridge data, especially here in the US, whether it's like the National Bridge Inventory or other sources of information. And then after that, we derive the fragility functions and also estimate the functionality loss in terms of like after a certain amount of time, like how quickly would we expect these bridges to be back and functional. So on this next slide, I show that, or at least like these are the bridges that we modeled in the area around LA. And so what we get from our bridge models, we use it as input to like our traffic simulation work. So for the traffic simulation work, we needed like two main information. One is like the network data, and the other side is like the demand data. So in terms of the network data, we used road network data from OpenStreetMap for the SCAG region, which is like the Southern California Association of Governments, which is composed of like the 6 counties that you can see over here. The network ended up being consisted of 600,000 intersections and 1.4 million roads. And then again, like I don't know if I can use a pointer. Yeah, so yeah, the output from our bridge models, we checked what the status is of these bridges and these roads 1 day after the earthquake, 3, 7, 14, 3 days after the earthquake, and we got like these information of like how many miles or how many bridges are actually not functional at the time. And so these images below show like the first one shows the road network that we used, the second one shows like the specific area around the port, and then the last one shows like which segments do we expect to be closed at certain days in our simulation. And in terms of the travel demand, we were able to get some travel demand data from SCAG. Overall, like it ended up consisting of 10.6 or 10.7 million trips, which you can see on the bottom left figure. In terms of port traffic in particular, which is like port trips that start or end on the port, there's around like 200,000 trips. So using these information about the road network and the output from our bridge models and the demand data, we are able to initialize our simulation, which we run for like a 24-hour time period with time steps of 15 minutes each. We use, as I mentioned earlier, a semi-dynamic traffic assignment model where we allow updates on travel times on the roads using this model here on the right side, where basically the travel time on roads would update depending on the congestion level at the time, and then the vehicles are assumed to choose the fastest path under the current road closure conditions and traffic congestion status. Yeah, and then once we get that, then we're able to get like what the travel times are, how heavy the congestion is on certain roads at certain times, and things like that. And after this, we wanted to get like a quick assessment of what the impact is in the area. And so at least like in terms of the traffic side of things, we looked into 3 components. The first is like the overall vehicle hours traveled, and then this one can be split into 2 things, which is the number of fulfilled trips, and yeah, so the number of fulfilled trips, or like trips that were still able to be completed despite closures, is like an indicator of network connectivity. And the second part is a change in travel time, which sort of is an indicator of like the need for vehicles to either reroute or take detours. So this, combined with like however much roads and bridges are closed, we're able to divide this into like what we would say is like a direct cost and indirect cost of the earthquake. And then overall, like this is what we modeled as like the economic impact. And then because we're also using like much more granular like bridge models and much more granular traffic assignment models, we're also able to get like temporal and spatial variation a look into those things impact-wise. So going through some results, in terms of like the number of fulfilled trips or like the lost demand, how many trips are not able to be completed anymore, we can see that there's like a 15% maximum decrease right after the earthquake, which then plateaus to around like 4% by 30 days after the earthquake. What's interesting to note here, I guess, is that on the figure on the right, which sort of like shows which trips are like overall affected and which trips are sort of like port-specific ones. one thing that we notice is that like 50% of the unfulfilled trips are port related, meaning they start or end on the port. And so this is sort of like says a bit intuitively that there is spatially disproportionate impacts to the port itself. In terms of travel time, we do see that right after the earthquake there is like a 6% maximum increase in travel time overall. But compared to the cost impact of the lost demand, like it is a bit dwarfed, as I will show in a later slide. And then in terms of the total vehicle hours traveled, it does decrease to like 12.5% and plateaus around 4% eventually. I think one thing that we were sort of like confused by initially is that like the vehicle hours traveled like drop a little bit more, like even like more days after the earthquake, even while recovery was already starting to happen. And I think one advantage of the model that we use is that we're able to like suss out what's going on here. So at least like for this particular instance, like we found that like internal roads or internal bridges within the port island are sort of fixed at some point, and so that decreases the travel time inside and in effect decreases, the hours traveled, even if like the overall like port island is not yet fully connected to the mainland. Yeah, so in terms of the economic impact assessment, I think what we sort of like find is that like the bulk of the cost is still in like the infrastructure. So like the direct cost is like the bulk of it, and we estimate it to be around $2 billion US. And then in terms of looking at the indirect costs, like as I mentioned earlier, much of it is focused on like the lost demand, and the delays are like a much smaller portion of it. Initially, we were trying to like see whether like this is something that we would compare to something like the GDP of the area, and looking at that is sort of like less than 1% of it. But I think one thing that's sort of like a bit more like useful to look at is like comparing it to something like a retrofit budget, or like what is sort of like the advantages or disadvantages, like the trade-off of sort of doing preventive work as opposed to like doing some repair work like afterwards. And I think speaking to that a little bit, like I tried looking at some figures about like, for example, in 2022, like there is like a $575 million US budget to look into repairing bridges. The five-year program budget total was around like $4.2 billion US. Even though like they also estimate that like the total repair cost would probably be around like $11 billion US. For our study in particular, looking at the direct and the indirect costs, I think that how we interpret the indirect costs is like these are the costs of externalities shouldered by individuals later on, and it shows that at least like the indirect costs as a fraction of the direct costs is that without proper mitigation, the total cost would increase by almost 50%. Yeah, and so I know I have to wrap up in like a minute or so, and so just like quick discussion points, which I mentioned earlier. Like there is like disproportionate impact, like the port area, at least in LA, the lost demand would dominate over like over delays, and almost 50% of the impact costs could be avoided with proper mitigation. And in terms of future work here, we want to include freight impacts more explicitly. So that's a bit in store in the future. But aside from that, I think that's all I have to present for today. Thank you so much for listening. I guess I can take questions if there are questions.
Are there any questions for Mike? Definitely stand up and yell.
I will yell. So I enjoyed your presentation.
You don't have to yell. Sorry.
I won't yell into the mic. So was the traffic disruption due only to roadway damage, or did you also consider disruptions to freight traffic from like the cranes, being damaged during an earthquake and other factors like that too?
So I have to yell. I think, yeah. So for at least like the initial thing that I presented, like the only thing that we considered or like we modeled in terms of closures or like the impacts to the bridges. I do know that those are also like other stuff that we could look into and are also probably as important. But yeah.
Please.
Come back and forth. I know you said you didn't do the portion on the characterization of the hazard, but my question to you is, do you have any idea on what details went into the characterization of the hazard, what models or which kind of features were included, what site features are not of that regard?
Thank you so much. I'm hesitant to like answer in detail, but I can give you like Barbara's email later on if you're interested in learning more information about that. Yeah, because we sort of like did our work in sort of like separate parts. But yeah, I'll send you over his email later. Yeah.
I know we should go to the next one. I have a quick question, but I'm so interested in your presentation. I think everyone is too. I'm going to ask a question, but when I speak at the end of the session, please don't ask me the same question. Liquefaction. Is that part of your study? Because in Seattle, that's going to be the major problem for our port facility. We don't do anything to remediate or prepare for that. Is liquefaction part of your study, or is that something to be done in the future?
I guess it's something to be done in the future because like we mainly looked at like bridges, right? And I think for liquefaction it would affect like even more of the roadways and stuff. So like that would need like a separate model that we wrote. But I think it would just be simple to integrate into like our transportation simulation stuff. So yeah, I guess that could be notched into my future work eventually. Thank you for the suggestion.
No, thank you. No, again, do not ask that question to the last speaker.
Thank you so much.